The air in Salem, Virginia, clung to the last vestiges of a damp, unforgiving October. It was 1892, and the chill that seeped into the bones of the townsfolk wasn't just from the weather. It was a creeping apprehension that had settled over the stately two-story farmhouse belonging to the Blackwell family. Inside, the silence was a heavy, suffocating blanket. The grand parlor, usually a place of robust discussion and the warmth of a crackling fire, was now a mausoleum. 3 people sat, or rather, endured, the quiet. Sheriff Alastair Finch, a man whose face was a roadmap of rural weariness. Mrs. Eleanor Vance, a neighbor whose eyes darted with a mixture of grief and barely contained gossip. And Elias Blackwell, the adopted son who was the epicenter of the room's terrible stillness. Elias was 22, his frame lean, his features sharp. Today, however, he looked carved from old wood, pale, rigid, and utterly hollow. He stared into the darkened, sooty hearth where the fire had died hours ago, the sight mirroring the state of his own internal world. His adoptive father, Mr. Thomas Blackwell, a prominent local landowner, had been found dead just 3 days prior. Not by illness, not by accident, but by a single brutal blow to the back of his skull, delivered while he was bent over his ledger in his study. Elias. Sheriff Finch's voice finally cut through the tension, sounding like gravel rolling downhill. "We need to go over the night again, slowly." Elias turned his gaze to the sheriff. His eyes, usually a clear hazel, were now cloudy with exhaustion and a deep, unreadable distress. "I told you, Sheriff. I was in the barn, checking on the mare. She's been restless." His voice was a flat monotone, devoid of inflection. "For 3 hours, son. From 9 until midnight. The mare was difficult. I fell asleep in the hayloft after I settled her. I came back to the house when the first light hit the window." Elias rubbed his temples, a gesture of profound fatigue. "That's when I found him. In the study. The lamp was still burning." Mrs. Vance gasped softly, a purely theatrical sound, and clutched her black lace shawl tighter. Poor Mr. Blackwell, a pillar of our community, taken like this. Her eyes, however, were fixed on Elias. The subtle movement of her lips suggested she was counting the potential flaws in his story. The crux of the mystery lay not just in the deceased, but in the living, specifically in Clara Blackwell, Elias's foster mother and the widow. She was 40, strikingly beautiful in a fragile, almost ethereal way, and now she was missing. "And Clara?" Sheriff Finch pressed, leaning forward, his shadow stretching across the Persian rug. "When did you last see your mother, Elias?" Elias flinched at the word mother. He and Clara had always shared a complicated dynamic, one that the close-knit Salem community had whispered about for years, ever since the boy had grown into a man. It wasn't the loving rapport of a son and his adoptive parent. It was something taut, intimate, and often fiercely argued. Thomas Blackwell had often seemed like a distant third party in their intense, closed-off world. "Before dinner," Elias answered, his jaw tight. "She was dressing for the evening. Said she had a headache and might stay up reading in her room." "But she wasn't in her room when you found your father," the sheriff countered, stating the established fact. "And she hasn't been seen since. Her overnight bag is gone and her horse is missing from the stable." "Perhaps she fled in shock," Mrs. Vance interjected, her voice dripping with skepticism. "She was always frail, wasn't she? The sight of that might have driven her mad." Elias ignored the neighbor, focusing solely on the sheriff. "I can't believe she's involved, Sheriff. She loved Father." The conviction in his voice wavered slightly, a crack in his otherwise solid facade of grief. The town knew that love was a word often used loosely in that household. The sheriff pulled a small, worn, leather-bound journal from his coat pocket. "We found this under your father's desk. It seems to be his private entries. The last entry is dated the day before he died." Elias's breath hitched. He knew the journal. Thomas kept it secretively, occasionally glancing up from it with a look of wounded rage that Elias had never been able to place. Sheriff Finch opened the book and read aloud, the words echoing ominously in the silent parlor. "The shame is too great. I cannot bear it. To see their closeness, her betrayal, his defiance. I told them both tonight it must end. If they refuse, I will expose the truth about his parentage and her secret debt. I will ruin them both before they ruin me." A profound shift occurred in the atmosphere. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Elias's control shattered, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists on his knees. "What debt? What truth about my parentage?" Elias demanded, his voice a sudden raw roar. "He never spoke of any debt." The sheriff calmly closed the journal. "He clearly planned to speak of it, Elias, and now he can't. And your foster mother, the other party to this closeness and betrayal, is gone." He let the implication hang in the heavy air. The mystery was thickening, pulling at the threads of a supposedly perfect family life. Thomas Blackwell had threatened to expose a secret that could destroy both his wife and his adopted son. Within 24 hours of that threat, he was dead, and his wife, the main suspect, had vanished. Elias was now alone, facing the scrutiny of the law and a community that was quickly painting him as either a devastated victim or a co-conspirator. The truth was buried beneath years of unspoken tension and coded glances shared across the Blackwell dinner table. And the deeper the sheriff dug into Thomas's affairs, the more it seemed that the affair was not the most macabre element of the Blackwell family life. It was the chilling, calculated silence that had preserved their dark secrets for so long. This is only the beginning of the horror. What truth did Thomas Blackwell uncover, and was it enough to drive Clara to murder and flight? Was Elias a willing accomplice, or simply a pawn caught in a deadly web of lies? The mystery deepens in the next chapter. If you're captivated by this blend of psychological terror and historical mystery, please take a moment to subscribe. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single part of this saga. The afternoon bled into a grim, foggy evening, draping Salem in a veil of secrecy. Sheriff Finch had dismissed Mrs. Vance, but the oppressive silence of the Blackwell parlor remained, now intensified by the implications of Thomas Blackwell's journal. Elias stood motionless by the window, his back to the sheriff, watching the fog swallow the silhouette of the barn. He was no longer the picture of frozen grief. Now he was a study in coiled fury and acute fear. "He lied to me my whole life," Elias finally whispered, his voice vibrating with suppressed violence. "He promised me a family, a name, and he held this secret debt and parentage over me, over her." Sheriff Finch sighed, the sound heavy in the room. He was a practical man, a veteran of small-town disputes. But this situation, a prominent man murdered, his wife vanished, and an adopted son with a clear motive for revenge, was testing his limits. "Elias, sit down," the sheriff instructed, his tone firm but not aggressive. "Let's talk about the debt. Did Mr. Blackwell ever mention financial troubles, large losses?" Elias turned, his face etched with confusion. "No. Quite the opposite. Father was obsessively frugal. He boasted that he owned half the land on this ridge, free and clear. He never borrowed a cent. He lent it. Who would he owe? And why would he write about it as a secret she carried?" The focus shifted uncomfortably to Clara Blackwell. The image of the beautiful, reserved woman began to warp in Elias's mind, transforming into something calculating and unfamiliar. "You said he threatened to expose the debt and the truth of your parentage to ruin them both," the sheriff reiterated, tapping the journal. "This implies both of you stood to lose something catastrophic." "Clara had a past before she married Father," Elias admitted, running a hand through his hair. "She came here from Richmond. She never spoke of her family, said they were estranged. But a debt? A financial ruin? She was terrified of poverty. If someone was threatening her, or if Father found out she'd jeopardized his estate." Elias trailed off, the horrific realization hitting him. Clara had a motive: to silence Thomas before he could destroy her financially and socially. And if she had done it, the missing horse and the packed bag suggested a well-planned escape. "Let's discuss the relationship, Elias," the sheriff pressed gently. "Your father wrote of your closeness and her betrayal. Salem is a small town. People talk. They whispered about the intensity between you and Mrs. Blackwell." Elias recoiled, his face flushing with a mixture of shame and fierce protectiveness. "That's gossip, Sheriff. Vile, small-minded gossip. Gossip often has a kernel of truth." "Was there something inappropriate, Elias? A physical relationship?" Elias walked back to the window, unable to face the sheriff's scrutiny. The tension between him and Clara had always been a complicated mesh of codependency, intellectual connection, and a deep, shared melancholy they both felt living under Thomas's domineering, unfeeling roof. It wasn't the kind of illicit affair the town craved, but it was close. A fierce emotional intimacy that excluded Thomas entirely. "We were close because we were both trapped," Elias finally confessed, his voice heavy. "Father kept us isolated. Clara taught me Latin and history. She was the only one who saw me as more than a laborer. We confided in each other. We dreamed of leaving. But no, Sheriff. It was never what they whispered." The sheriff noted the denial, but also the nuanced explanation. It sounded truthful, yet it only complicated the dynamic. A shared resentment of Thomas, a mutual longing for freedom, and now a shared enemy, the dead man. "But you both wanted him gone," the sheriff observed, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. "I wanted him to stop suffocating us, not dead," Elias roared. He quickly checked himself, remembering the need for composure. The focus shifted again to the circumstances of the murder. No forced entry. Only family members were present that night. The murder weapon was still missing. A heavy, blunt object, likely something from the house or the barn. "Elias, where is the shovel we kept in the woodpile behind the kitchen?" the sheriff asked suddenly. Elias frowned. "The garden spade? I haven't seen it since last week." "Why?" "It's heavy, solid iron. It fits the wound description," Finch replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. "We searched the property. It's not in the shed, the barn, or the woodpile." The missing shovel was the final, terrifying piece of the puzzle. It suggested not a panicked act, but a planned one, with the weapon disposed of meticulously. If Clara had fled, she might have buried the weapon before leaving. If Elias was involved, he had done the same. A heavy knock on the front door interrupted the interrogation. It was Deputy Miller, drenched in fog, holding a small, oil-soaked piece of paper in a protected glass vial. "Sheriff, look what we found in the old washhouse cistern, nearly dissolved," Miller said, handing over the vial. "It's a train ticket, one way, bound for New Orleans." Finch held the vial up to the light. The date was yesterday. The ticket was issued to a passenger named C. Vance. "C. Vance?" Elias questioned, baffled. "Who is that? Why wouldn't she use her own name? And why New Orleans?" The sheriff looked from the ticket to Elias, then back to the chilling entry in Thomas's journal. "I will expose the truth about his parentage and her secret debt. C. Vance may not be a simple alias, Elias. It may be her maiden name," the sheriff stated, a grim realization dawning. "And if she has a secret past, a debt tied to it, and a connection to New Orleans, this is no random flight. This is a return." The question of who was the murderer, the desperate wife or the enraged son, was now complicated by a third, chilling possibility. Clara Blackwell had planned her escape long before Thomas was killed, using the murder as a shield or a catalyst. Elias, who believed they were bound by shared misery, might have been left behind, completely blindsided, while Clara was already halfway to a new life, a dark past waiting to claim her. The following morning, Sheriff Finch stood in the austere office of Mr. Silas Thorne, the president of the Salem Commercial Bank. The air smelled of old paper, ink, and money, a scent of brittle trust. Thorne, a man whose tailored suit seemed too formal for the rural setting, was sweating despite the cool air. "I assure you, Sheriff, Mr. Blackwell's finances were utterly sound," Thorne insisted, adjusting his pince-nez. He held a substantial balance and several high-value bonds. "The only unusual activity—" Thorne paused, pulling a heavy ledger closer. Finch leaned across the polished mahogany desk, his patience wearing thin. The trail to New Orleans was cold, and the townsfolk's scrutiny of Elias Blackwell was reaching a fever pitch. "Spit it out, Thorne," Finch ordered. "The unusual activity involves his safe deposit box," Thorne confessed, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Box 41. Mr. Blackwell visited it often, usually on the first day of the month. He kept all his vital documents and presumably a portion of his gold there. However, 3 weeks ago, Mrs. Blackwell visited the bank." Finch straightened up. "Clara, she had access?" "Yes, Mr. Blackwell had given her the key and the necessary authorization back when they were first married. A show of trust, he called it. She signed the logbook, accessed the box, and spent almost an hour in the private viewing room. And what did she take?" Thorne flipped a page in the ledger. "She took the contents of the box, all of it. The log notes the removal of documents, bonds, and personal effects. She signed a waiver confirming the box was now empty. We assumed Mr. Blackwell was aware." Finch swore under his breath. 3 weeks ago, before Thomas had written the damning journal entry about the secret debt and his plan to ruin them both, it suggested Clara was not reacting to Thomas's threat. She was preparing for an inevitable confrontation, or perhaps preempting his actions. Did she remove any specific documents, a will, anything pertaining to Elias's adoption or his biological parents? Finch probed, connecting the bank activity to the secrets in the journal. "We wouldn't know the specific contents, Sheriff, but the box contained the only copies of the Blackwell estate deed and Mr. Blackwell's original will. Both are gone." This raised the stakes dramatically. Clara had secured Thomas's assets and documents, potentially eliminating all legal evidence of Elias's parentage and her own history before the murder. If the documents proving the debt and Elias's true family were in that box, they were now traveling with Clara toward New Orleans. Finch returned to the Blackwell farmhouse, where Elias sat in the kitchen, meticulously cleaning a pair of hunting boots, his focus unsettlingly intense. "We found a ticket to New Orleans issued to a C. Vance, which we believe is Clara's maiden name. And we know she cleaned out your father's safe deposit box 3 weeks ago," Finch stated, watching Elias closely. Elias stopped cleaning, his expression shifting from detached concentration to cold shock. She emptied the box. Why wouldn't she tell me? We were supposed to be in this together." The hurt in his voice was palpable, a betrayal deeper than the murder itself. "She packed a bag, took money, and took the secrets. She didn't trust you, Elias. Or perhaps she wanted you to take the fall." "I don't believe it," Elias insisted, shaking his head vehemently. "She might have taken the money to protect it, but she wouldn't just abandon me. She knew what this town would do to me." Finch paced the kitchen's worn plank floor. "What if you helped her, Elias? What if the closeness was real and you planned his death together? She escapes with the assets and you provide her with the alibi, sleeping in the hayloft before joining her later." The accusation was sharp, direct. Elias met the sheriff's gaze, his eyes hard and unwavering. "I was in the barn, Sheriff. Alone. I hated Thomas, yes, but I did not lift that shovel. And if Clara took it, if she used it, then she fooled us both. She played the frail, oppressed wife while planning this escape. But if she did, she made a mistake." "What mistake?" Finch asked, leaning on the back of a wooden chair. "The silver locket," Elias said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "It was the only thing she truly owned. An heirloom from her real family. She never took it off. She wore it every day, even when she slept. It was a thick, carved piece. She always said it contained something important, something she couldn't trust to a bank." "Did she take it with her?" Elias slowly rose and walked over to a small, ornate writing desk Clara used. He opened the top drawer, reached under a stack of dried lavender sachets, and retrieved a small object wrapped in a silk handkerchief. He unwrapped it. Inside lay a heavy silver locket, intricately carved with the image of a ship. It was cold to the touch. It was here, hidden. If she truly fled, truly abandoned everything, she would have taken this locket. It was her most prized possession. It means she didn't leave willingly, Sheriff. Or she left in a panic, without the time to gather what mattered most. The locket was a significant piece of evidence that countered the calculated escape plan suggested by the train ticket and the empty safe deposit box. If Clara had been planning for weeks, why leave the one item she claimed was irreplaceable? Finch took the heavy locket, his mind reeling from the conflicting evidence. The calculated escape route, the secured assets, the missing weapon, and the one crucial heirloom left behind. The truth was not a simple black and white murder. It was a deep, psychological knot of betrayals, secrets, and a terrifying sense of desperation. The missing shovel, the hidden locket, and the train ticket to New Orleans, all pieces of a puzzle that refused to form a clear picture. The focus shifted from who committed the murder to why the one person who knew all the secrets had fled so meticulously, yet left behind the one key to her past. Sheriff Finch brought the silver locket to Mr. Abner Pike, Salem's aging, meticulous silversmith. Pike's shop was crammed with tools, tarnished metal, and the smell of sulfur. "It's a fine piece, Sheriff," Pike commented, examining the locket under a jeweler's loupe. "Not local work. The craftsmanship is European, maybe French. But look here." Pike pointed a thin metal scribe at the back of the locket, where a minute inscription was almost hidden by the patina. It was a tiny, faint symbol, a stylized compass rose, deeply cut into the metal. "That's the mark of a cartographer," Pike explained. "A signature used by map makers in the trade. Why would it be on a woman's locket?" Finch felt a chill. Cartography, maps, secrets, and a debt. These elements were beginning to form a terrifying sequence. "Did you ever see Mrs. Blackwell wear this, Abner?" "Yes, all the time. But I never touched it. She was fiercely protective of it. Once, she scratched it badly and I offered to repair it, but she refused. Said it was meant to stay flawed." The conversation ended with no immediate answers, but with a new direction. The compass rose. It was a clue to Clara's past, and possibly to the nature of the secret debt Thomas had threatened to expose. Perhaps the debt wasn't just financial, maybe it was a debt of silence, a secret tied to a specific location or a dangerous past. Back at the farmhouse, the search of Thomas Blackwell's study continued, focusing now on anything related to geography, travel, or maps. Elias, still under effective house arrest, joined the search, driven by the desire to understand the woman who had fostered and then seemingly abandoned him. Under a false bottom in Thomas's mahogany desk, Elias found a single, hand-drawn map. It was a crude, hastily executed sketch of an area along the Mississippi Delta, specifically a property outside of New Orleans, where the bayous met the dense forest. The map was marked with two distinct symbols, a crude X next to a dilapidated dock, and a small, precise drawing of a compass rose, identical to the one etched on the back of Clara's locket. Elias called Finch over, his voice tight with discovery. This is where she was going. This is the place. And look, the symbol on the locket. It's on the map." Finch took the map, his expression grim. "This confirms the ticket to New Orleans was no coincidence, and it ties the locket directly to the secret. This wasn't a personal keepsake, Elias. It was a key." "A key to what?" Elias wondered, his mind racing. "A hidden treasure? A secret inheritance? Or a secret responsibility?" Finch countered, his focus on the X on the dock. Thomas Blackwell was a landowner. Perhaps he wasn't owed the debt. Perhaps he owned the debt, or controlled the asset, and Clara was trying to reclaim it. The implications were chilling. Thomas had been using this secret, a piece of land, a property, or a dangerous situation in New Orleans to control Clara. When he threatened to expose it, he wasn't just threatening her reputation. He was threatening to expose a situation that could ruin her, or worse, endanger her life. Elias leaned against the desk, his head spinning. So she wasn't running from the murder. She was running to this location, to secure something, or someone. Or to meet the person to whom the debt is owed, Finch corrected. This map is old. Look at the paper. It could be from 20 years ago. The secret runs deep, Elias. Deeper than a love affair. As the sheriff examined the map, he noticed something glued to the back of the sketch. A small, faded newspaper clipping from the New Orleans Chronicle, dated 1878. The headline was terse: Bayou Fire claims owner of Delta property. The body of the article was short, reporting the tragic death of a man named Mr. Alistair Vance, the same surname on Clara's train ticket, who died in a mysterious fire on his isolated property near the Mississippi. The article mentioned he left behind a young daughter. Elias read the name Alistair Vance, a deep sense of dread washing over him. Alistair Vance. That must have been her father. She was running home, to the property where her father died. Finch felt the pieces clicking into a terrifying alignment. Clara Vance, now Blackwell, had a traumatic past connected to a mysterious fire, a specific property, and a secret debt. Thomas Blackwell had somehow acquired knowledge or control over this property and was using it to manipulate Clara. Thomas Blackwell wasn't a victim of random violence, Elias. He was silenced. He knew a secret about Clara's past that was so destructive, so dangerous, that she was willing to commit murder or have someone else commit it to keep it buried, Finch concluded. But the question remained. If Clara was the murderer, why was the shovel missing, and who was Alistair Vance's daughter truly running from in New Orleans? Was the Bayou Fire truly an accident, or was it the first chapter in this unfolding tragedy, and Thomas Blackwell's murder simply the second? The following days were marked by a suffocating silence in Salem, a town waiting for the noose to tighten around Elias Blackwell. Sheriff Finch, however, was focused on the two conflicting pieces of evidence, the meticulous preparation for flight and the abandoned precious locket. He decided to focus on the one person who knew Thomas Blackwell's financial and personal affairs better than anyone, Mr. Edwin Cobb, Thomas's longtime business partner and executor of his estate. Cobb, a nervous, perpetually adjusting man, met Finch at the Salem courthouse. He spoke reluctantly, his eyes constantly scanning the street as if afraid of being overheard. Thomas was not a man of sentiment, Sheriff, Cobb began, fiddling with his collar. He bought land, he sold futures, and he held his secrets close. But there was one thing he was afraid of: not losing money, losing control. Did he ever mention a property in New Orleans? The Delta region? Finch asked, presenting the map. Cobb's pale face went a shade paler. He stared at the crude sketch, his hands trembling slightly. The Delta property. Yes. He mentioned it once about 3 years ago, said he had acquired a nuisance along the Mississippi, a complicated deed, a legal entanglement. He laughed and called it his insurance policy against personal misfortune. Against whom? Cobb swallowed hard. He never named anyone, but he made sure the papers were airtight. He said if anything happened to him, or if certain promises weren't kept, the property would revert to the most undesirable claimant. He set up the legal terms specifically to inflict maximum damage on anyone who defied him. This confirmed Finch's suspicion. Thomas Blackwell wasn't just holding a debt over Clara, he was holding the title to a piece of land connected to her traumatic past, and he had structured the ownership to be a time-delayed bomb. Did Clara know about this? Finch pressed. I assume so. Thomas had a cruel streak, Sheriff. He liked to remind people who held the leash. I think he enjoyed seeing her anxiety about it. And the secret debt he wrote about in his journal? Was it financial? Cobb shook his head emphatically. No, I handled all his accounts. Thomas never risked his capital on anything outside his direct view. The only debt Thomas ever incurred was personal, and it was paid in full years ago when he adopted Elias. Finch felt a jolt of alarm. The adoption? What do you mean? Cobb leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. Elias was not adopted from an orphanage, Sheriff. He was adopted from a private arrangement. Elias's biological mother was a young woman who worked at the Richmond factory where Thomas made his first fortune. She was poor, destitute, and Thomas, he had an entanglement with her. Elias's biological mother. Not just some anonymous parentage, but a direct, intimate, and dark secret connected to Thomas. Was Elias Thomas's biological son? Cobb hesitated, then nodded slowly. That's what Thomas confessed to me years ago. He paid the mother a large sum, the secret debt, to give the boy up and vanish. He brought Elias here, claiming he was adopted from a faraway orphanage to protect his own reputation. He couldn't have a bastard son, but he also couldn't allow the mother to raise his child. He needed the child to carry on the name, but without the shame. The truth about Elias's parentage was shattering. Thomas had paid for his own son to be a foster son, all to preserve his public image. The secret debt was the initial payment and the subsequent silence bought from the biological mother. And Clara? Did she know? Cobb looked away, his shame evident. She knew. Thomas told her before they married. He used it as a warning, that he was capable of great deception and control. He essentially bought his wife's silence too, in exchange for the promise of status. The web of psychological terror was now complete. Thomas was murdered not just for money or passion, but because he was about to weaponize the two biggest secrets in the house. Clara's traumatic past tied to the Delta property, which Thomas controlled as an insurance policy. Elias's true parentage, that he was the biological son Thomas pretended to adopt, a secret that, if exposed, would ruin Thomas's public life, but also devastate Elias. Thomas's journal entry took on a horrific new clarity. I will expose the truth about his parentage and her secret debt. I will ruin them both before they ruin me. Elias was caught between two deadly secrets, and Clara was the only person who connected them. She was running toward the Delta property, a place that held the key to the first secret, and running away from Elias, the living embodiment of the second. The crucial question remained. Why would Clara leave the locket? If it contained the key to her past and the map to the Delta property, why not take it if her flight was meticulously planned? The locket's abandonment suggested a last-minute disruption, a sudden panicked choice, or a deliberate, calculated misdirection designed to focus the investigation away from the true nature of her past and the real motive for Thomas's death. Sheriff Finch drove back to the Blackwell farm, the chilling details of Elias's true parentage and Thomas's calculated cruelty swirling in his mind. The investigation was no longer about a murder. It was an excavation of the soul of a rotten family. He found Elias in Thomas's study, staring at the map of the Delta property, his jaw set in a rigid line of barely contained rage and grief. He paid for me, Elias muttered, not looking up. He paid my own mother to surrender me. And then he used that lie to control the woman who raised me. He was a ruthless man, Elias. But he is dead. We need to focus on what Clara was running to, Finch said. Placing the silver locket on the map, the compass rose, marking the Delta location. This locket is the key, Sheriff. Why did she leave it? If she was going to that property, she needed whatever is inside it, Elias insisted. Finch picked up the locket. Mr. Pike said he was never allowed to repair it. It's heavy, Elias. Too heavy for a simple picture or a lock of hair. He returned to the kitchen, the light being better there, and began a systematic examination of the silver piece. Using a small penknife, he probed the seams of the intricate carving. After several agonizing minutes, the carving of the sailing ship on the front gave way with a faint click. The locket was not a simple hinge and snap piece. It was a false chamber. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was not a miniature photograph or a sentimental trinket, but a small, tightly rolled piece of parchment, brittle with age. Finch carefully unrolled the parchment. It was a document, not a letter, but a deed of sale, dated 1878, signed by Alistair Vance. It concerned the Delta property in New Orleans. The document clearly stated that the property, in the event of Vance's death, would revert to his sole heir, his daughter, Clara Vance. However, a clause at the bottom, initialed by Alistair Vance, stated that the property could be legally seized if a debt, specifically a sum of $5,000, was not repaid within 10 years. The note had been purchased by a creditor in Richmond in 1880, and then in 1888 the final transfer was signed. The note was now owned by Thomas Blackwell. "She left this for a reason," Finch stated, handing the document to Elias. "This is the secret debt Thomas held over her. It wasn't a secret she carried. It was a secret he used to legally extort her. If she failed to repay the $5,000 before Thomas's death, the property, her only inheritance and connection to her real family, would fall entirely to Thomas's estate." Elias read the document, his eyes wide with understanding and fresh hatred for the dead man. "And Thomas died without a valid will, because she took the original from the bank. If there's no will, the estate, including this note and the claim on the Delta property, would fall into probate, causing years of legal chaos. It would protect her inheritance, or at least buy her time." "Exactly," Finch confirmed. "Thomas was murdered before he could invoke the seizure clause. Clara was running to New Orleans, not to escape the law, but to repay the debt in person, secure the deed, and physically reclaim her property before the legal chaos began in Salem. But where would she get $5,000 in 1892? That was a massive sum, equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars today." Elias, suddenly galvanized, raced to the grand parlor. He knelt by the mantelpiece and ran his fingers over the elaborate carvings of the marble. He pressed a specific spot, a rose in the carving, and a small, nearly invisible panel slid open. Inside the shallow recess lay a stack of crisp, clean $100 bills, bound with a simple rubber band. "He hid it here," Elias breathed. "Father always kept a small operating fund outside the bank for emergencies. It's all here. Enough money to buy a good horse, a ticket, and—" He counted quickly, his fingers moving expertly. "It's exactly $5,000, Sheriff." Finch stared at the money. This was the most damning piece of evidence yet. Clara had access to the cash Thomas had kept hidden. She could have taken it at any point. So she had the money, the motivation, and the means to flee, Finch summarized, his voice flat. She took the money, retrieved the debt papers from the locket's secret chamber, and left the locket behind as a trail, a breadcrumb, to explain her flight as a financial necessity, not a panicked escape from a murder she committed. "But the shovel is still missing," Elias argued, his hands shaking as he repacked the money into the recess. "And she still left the only thing that tied her to her past, a trail she couldn't be sure would be discovered. She left it because she had to, Elias. Not for you, but for the law. If she fled without leaving a plausible reason for the money's absence, the theft itself would have sealed her guilt. By leaving the deed and the money behind, she created a scenario where her flight looks like a panicked attempt to resolve a financial threat rather than a planned murder." The truth was now almost unbearable. Clara had been preparing for this for weeks, moving assets, securing her escape, and leaving behind a meticulously crafted narrative of desperation. The psychological toll of living under Thomas's control had driven her to a calculating, brutal crime. The evidence now overwhelmingly pointed to Clara Blackwell as the calculating murderer, driven by years of psychological torment and the imminent threat of financial and personal ruin at the hands of Thomas. The locket, the money, the missing shovel, all pointed to a premeditated act and a meticulously planned escape. Sheriff Finch decided to issue a warrant for Clara Vance Blackwell's arrest. The investigation had run its course in Salem. The next step was to alert the authorities in New Orleans and track the C. Vance train ticket. Elias was technically cleared of the murder, but he was left a hollow shell, not only mourning the death of his adopted father, but facing the chilling betrayal of the woman he had relied on for emotional connection and solace. He walked through the house, now feeling like a tomb, running his hand over the furniture, feeling the cold, hard reality of the lies that had sustained his life. He stopped in the kitchen and noticed a slight discoloration on the bottom of the old wooden table where Clara had often worked. Kneeling, he ran his hand along the bottom edge of the table's wooden frame. His fingers brushed against a piece of paper, folded and taped into the small, dusty gap where the table edge met the leg. It was an envelope, made of heavy, cream-colored paper, sealed with a thick wax imprint of a raven, a symbol Clara often used. The envelope was addressed simply, Elias, to be read only when I am gone. Elias's hands trembled violently as he broke the seal. This was it, her final words, the confession, the explanation for the decade of lies, and the brutal murder. He unfolded the letter. Clara's elegant, looping script filled the page. My dearest Elias, if you are reading this, I have failed, or perhaps I have succeeded, and the consequence is simply that I must now leave you forever. This letter is not a confession, but a final act of honesty, something Thomas never afforded either of us. Thomas did not just buy your adoption, he bought my silence. He acquired the deed to my father's Delta property when he married me, promising to return it when I showed sufficient loyalty. That loyalty was never earned. He used that property, my true home, as a weapon to control me, just as he used the lie of your adoption to control you. I emptied the safe deposit box not for myself, but for us. I took the old will, because Thomas had secretly written a new one. I saw it, a spiteful final document that disinherited you, leaving everything to a distant cousin and ensuring the immediate seizure of the Delta property. He planned to deliver it to Mr. Cobb the day after he died. He planned to leave you with nothing and destroy my last link to my family. I did not kill him, Elias, but I knew someone would have to. He had cornered us both. The night he died, I received an anonymous, frantic note slipped under my door, stating simply, "The shovel is missing. He knows. Run. Meet me at the first junction on the Richmond Road." I took the money from his hiding place, not as a thief, but as a payment for the one who had finally given us freedom. I left the locket and the debt paper intentionally. I knew the locket would lead the investigation to my financial plight and the Delta property. I needed the sheriff to believe I fled out of desperation to save my inheritance, not to cover up a murder. I needed him to think I was a fugitive, not an accomplice. The train ticket to C. Vance was purchased by the note writer. It was my way out. I am now heading to New Orleans, not to settle a debt with money, but to settle a debt of loyalty and protection with the person who finally had the courage to silence Thomas. The one who has been secretly working against Thomas's cruelty for years. I had to leave you behind to protect you, Elias. If I am caught, I will be a murderer. If you join me, you will be an accomplice. Stay in Salem, inherit the chaos, and rebuild your life. Find the missing shovel, Elias. Find the person who wrote the note. They are the key to the truth, and they are still in Salem. The shovel will not be found on the Delta property, because the person who used it did not flee with me. They are here. The only thing that ever mattered was protecting you from Thomas's twisted plan. Forgive me for the lies. Remember the truth. Clara. Elias finished the letter, his breath catching in his throat. Not a murderer, but a terrified woman, caught in a web of lies, helped by a secret accomplice who was still in Salem. The missing shovel was the final terrifying piece. It was the accomplice's signature, and it proved Elias was still in danger. Clara is gone, but the murderer remains. Who is the secret accomplice? The person who knew Thomas's fatal plan and gave Clara the warning. And where would a killer hide a heavy iron shovel in a small town like Salem? The investigation must now turn inward, toward the close circle of people Thomas Blackwell truly threatened. If you're captivated by this blend of psychological terror and historical mystery, please take a moment to subscribe. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single part of this saga. Elias was no longer a suspect, but a man possessed by a chilling mission: to find the person who had written Clara the note, and to find the missing shovel. The accomplice had to be someone who knew of Thomas's plan to disinherit Elias and seize the Delta property, had access to the house to slip the note to Clara, was capable of the physical act of murder and hiding the heavy shovel. Elias focused his attention on the individuals who had been closest to Thomas, yet often treated with casual cruelty: Mrs. Vance, the intrusive neighbor, and Mr. Harrison, the elderly, taciturn groundskeeper who had worked the Blackwell land for 40 years. He knew Mrs. Vance was too timid and too obsessed with reputation to commit a murder. But Harrison, the groundskeeper, was a man of immense strength and silent resentment. Elias found Harrison tending the small, meticulously kept vegetable garden behind the stable. The ground was cold and hard, but Harrison was working a section, laying down a thick blanket of new mulch. "Mr. Harrison, I need to talk to you about the night Father died," Elias began, his voice low and firm. Harrison didn't stop working. "Nothing to say, Mr. Elias. I was in my cabin, slept right through the whole thing. The sheriff already asked. The shovel, Mr. Harrison, the heavy iron spade. It's missing. Have you seen it?" Harrison paused, leaning heavily on a rake. He finally looked up at Elias, and in his eyes Elias saw not the usual quiet deference, but a deep, profound weariness. "The shovel's where it should be, Mr. Elias," Harrison said, "just not where the sheriff was looking." Elias felt a cold current of certainty rush through him. "You know where it is." Harrison sighed, a sound of heavy resignation. "I know where it is, and I know what it did. I buried it. Just after midnight, the night Thomas died." Elias took a step back, shocked not by the confession of the shovel's burial, but by the casual, almost relieved way Harrison admitted it. You helped Clara?" Harrison shook his head slowly. "Clara didn't need my help to run. I wrote the note, Mr. Elias. I slipped it under her door. I killed Thomas Blackwell. She just fled the consequence." Elias stood paralyzed, the pieces of the puzzle snapping violently into place. The groundskeeper, the silent man of the land, was the murderer. "Why, Mr. Harrison? Why did you kill him?" Harrison pointed the handle of the rake toward the ground. "This land. Thomas didn't just own the property. He owned the people on it. I worked for him since I was 20. He promised me a pension, a small cottage when I was too old to work. 2 weeks ago he told me he was writing a new will, the one Clara mentioned, and that it explicitly revoked my retirement. Said I was too old to be worth the expense. He threatened to leave you destitute? He did more than threaten. He laughed, said he'd put me out on the street. Thomas Blackwell's great joy was crushing the small hopes of the people who served him. He was a cancer on this property. But the note to Clara, why warn her? Why involve her?" Harrison looked at Elias with a pitying gaze. "Because I knew Thomas's final cruel plan. He showed me the new will. He told me he was going to destroy her father's property in New Orleans just to hurt her. And he told me he was going to expose the lie about your parentage, knowing it would destroy your reputation. He wanted to ruin you both from beyond the grave. You killed him, not for yourself, but to save us from his last act of malice?" Elias asked, a strange mix of horror and gratitude flooding him. "I killed him for the decency he denied us all. I slipped the note to Clara, telling her the shovel was missing, because I needed her to believe I was a mystery, a ghost, so she would run and take the money to New Orleans, just as Thomas had feared, thus ensuring the will would be thrown into chaos and her father's property would be safe from seizure. And the shovel, where is it?" Harrison walked toward a large, shallow wooden basin used for soaking tools. He pulled back the top layer of new mulch he had just laid down. Beneath it, the soil was freshly disturbed. "I didn't take it off the property. Too heavy, too risky," Harrison explained. "I buried it under the kennel for Thomas's hunting dogs. He loved those dogs, Mr. Elias. They were the only thing he truly cared about. He would never allow me to dig there. The ground is packed hard. I buried it deep and put the old doghouse back over it. No one would ever think to look there. The irony was chilling. The murder weapon was hidden right under the nose of the investigation, buried beneath the very symbol of Thomas's twisted affection. You've solved the crime, Mr. Elias. Now what do you do? Harrison challenged, his eyes reflecting the deep moral compromise he had made. Turn me in, and Thomas wins. His will destroys your life, and Clara's life is ruined. Keep silent, and you inherit the estate and your freedom. The choice is yours. The choice was a profound exercise in moral terror. To uphold the law meant succumbing to the dead man's final cruel wish. To protect the murderer meant securing his own future and protecting Clara's one remaining link to her family. Elias stood motionless in the garden, the weight of Harrison's confession pressing down on him. The stench of wet earth and freshly turned mulch filled the air, a grotesque counterpoint to the enormity of the secret he now carried. The choice was clear and terrifying. The law demanded justice, survival demanded complicity. He looked at Harrison, the loyal, elderly groundskeeper, now a confessed murderer driven by years of servitude and a final act of self-preservation, mingled with a bizarre, twisted form of loyalty to Elias and Clara. You said Thomas's dogs were the only thing he cared about, Elias said, his voice husky. He loved the spectacle of control, but he was cruel to you, to me, and to Clara. He bought everything, Mr. Elias. Your name, my loyalty, Clara's freedom. It all came with a price of constant humiliation, Harrison replied, picking up his rake, returning to the pretense of work. I simply took back the price. Elias made his decision, not out of malice, but out of a profound sense of moral debt to the living, and a rejection of the toxic legacy of the dead. The shovel stays where it is, Mr. Harrison, Elias stated. I never saw that shovel. And I never spoke to you this afternoon. The law will believe what the evidence tells them, that Clara Vance, driven mad by Thomas's threats to ruin her, killed him and fled to save her inheritance. Harrison stopped and gave a slow, respectful nod. Thank you, Mr. Elias. You are the better man Thomas never was. Elias returned to the house, the atmosphere of fear now replaced by an overwhelming sense of profound, cold complicity. He went to Thomas's study and took the hidden $5,000 from the mantelpiece. He needed to ensure Clara's plan was completed. He sat down at the desk and wrote a single brief telegram to a banking associate in New Orleans, authorizing the immediate transfer of the $5,000 to a registered private account in the name of C. Vance, with the instructions, settle all outstanding claims on the Delta property immediately. Do not delay. This was the final, irreversible step. By transferring the money, Elias was not just saving Clara's inheritance. He was actively covering the final traces of the crime, ensuring the motive for her flight was cemented as a financial necessity rather than a murderous escape. Sheriff Finch returned late that evening, visibly frustrated. The search for the missing shovel had come up empty. He believed he had all the evidence he needed, the motive, the missing bank box, the ticket, and the money's disappearance, but the missing weapon gnawed at him. I'm issuing the arrest warrant for Clara Blackwell tomorrow, Elias, Finch declared, weary. It's a solid case of premeditated murder, driven by Thomas's threat to seize her property. She panicked, lashed out, and fled. Elias maintained his composure, the weight of the hidden truth heavy on his chest. She was broken, Sheriff. Thomas broke her. I hope she finds peace in New Orleans. The sheriff accepted the explanation, a tragic conclusion that satisfied the town's need for an answer. The truth, that Thomas was murdered by an old, oppressed groundskeeper in a final quiet act of rebellion, was too strange, too complex, and would only serve to expose Thomas's long history of psychological abuse. As Finch left the house, Elias stood alone in the hallway, looking up the grand staircase. The house was his now. The land was his. The legacy of lies was his to inherit. He had secured his future, but at the cost of a moral compromise that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The psychological terror of the story was not in the murder, but in the moral aftermath. The decision to protect a killer to escape the tyranny of the victim. 3 months had passed. Winter had hardened the ground and frozen the secrets of the Blackwell farm deep beneath the soil. The warrant for Clara Vance Blackwell remained active, but the trail to New Orleans had gone cold. She had successfully completed the transaction, secured the Delta property, and vanished into the anonymity of the American South. Elias Blackwell, now the sole heir, had inherited the entire estate. He was a wealthy man, but a man alone, bearing the silent, crushing weight of 2 massive secrets, his true parentage and the true identity of the murderer. He stood in the grand parlor, watching the groundskeeper, Mr. Harrison, calmly raking the fallen leaves near the dog kennel, the burial site of the shovel. Harrison was now paid handsomely, a silent partner in the crime, his loyalty purchased not with money, but with the freedom from Thomas's oppression. Elias had kept his promise. He was not a murderer, nor an accomplice, but a guardian of a necessary, terrible secret. He had often thought of reporting Harrison, of cleansing his conscience, but every time he was stopped by the cold, hard logic. If he reported the truth, the authorities would exhume the shovel. The trial would expose Thomas's wicked new will, and the estate would be tied up for years, potentially ruining Clara's efforts to secure the Delta property. Thomas would win from the grave. Elias walked to the study, the room where Thomas had died, and now the room where Elias conducted his life. He found the key to the safe deposit box and planned a trip to the Salem Commercial Bank. He was not going to withdraw money. He was going to deposit an item. He walked into Mr. Silas Thorne's office, the bank president greeting him with a newfound, respectful cordiality. "Mr. Blackwell, what a pleasure. Your father's affairs are finally settled. The estate is yours, free and clear." Elias nodded, placing a small, heavy object on Thorne's desk. It was the silver locket, the key to Clara's secret, which he had retrieved from Sheriff Finch as a family keepsake. "I'd like to open a new safe deposit box, Mr. Thorne, box 42, and I want to deposit this," Elias stated, his voice steady. "The locket." "Certainly, sir. A family heirloom." "No, it's an insurance policy," Elias replied, using Thomas's own cynical phrasing. "It's proof of a financial transaction, a key to a truth I never want revealed." He placed the locket into the box, sealing the secret not just with the steel door, but with his own moral silence. He had learned Thomas's greatest lesson. Secrets are not meant to be shared. They are meant to be controlled and weaponized. As Elias left the bank, a new man, the psychological burden had become his new, chilling strength. He was free from Thomas's tyranny, but he was forever bound to a murderer. He walked past the post office and paused. A letter had arrived from New Orleans. It was addressed to him, in an unfamiliar hand. He tore it open. Inside, there was a single, plain sheet of paper, no signature, just 2 words, written in a clear, decisive script. "Thank you." It was from Clara. She was safe. She was free. She had received the money and secured her home. Elias closed his eyes, a thin, almost imperceptible smile crossing his lips. The cycle of oppression had ended, replaced by a silent, symbiotic pact of complicity and survival. The horrible family murder was solved, not by the law, but by a chilling, necessary act of moral reckoning. The true horror was not the death, but the life that followed, a life built on the foundations of a lie and protected by a secret that could never be told. The man who had been the victim of his father's cruelty had become the master of his silence, inheriting a wealth he could never truly enjoy and a truth he could never truly confess.